What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Pit Limiter Podcast. It is episode number 5. I am your host, Zach Buchanan. Let's jump right into it. Stop and go. So, this past week, Patricio O'Ward announced that he's going to be racing for Carlin Racing in this year's NTT IndyCar Series for 13 races. One of those races including the Indianapolis 500. Kyle Busch hit 199 NASCAR National Series victories with his win on Sunday in the Monster Energy Cup Series race at ISM Speedway. He won the Xfinity race on Saturday as well as 2 races the weekend prior. A little bit of scare for IndyCar fans on Sunday. Driver Ed Jones was in a little bit of a wallbanger crash at St. Petersburg in turn number 9. Ended up fracturing a bone in his hand. However, they did confirm that they're going to have a splint for him to race with, so he is expected to race at Circuit of the Americas. If you watched the IndyCar race at St. Petersburg on Sunday, you might have noticed that the power went out on the stream mid-race. About 10 laps, roughly 13-ish minutes. NBCSN was experiencing some technical difficulties. Actually, the race kind of sounded like an old radio broadcast. The race ended up receiving a .38 overnight rating. And finally, Davey Hamilton Jr., son of former IndyCar driver Davey Hamilton. We recently talked about him in one of our prior episodes. Was arrested last month in West Palm Beach over charges of aggravated assault and false imprisonment. Posted bail recently and has entered a plea deal of not guilty to both felony charges. So that wraps it up for this week's segment of Stop and Go. We have a very special guest this week. He's got 37,000 plus subscribers on YouTube. He's probably the biggest IndyCar fan that I know of, and for some reason Reddit hates him. David Land, what's up, buddy?
Hi, pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
So I'm just going to dive right into it. Why does Reddit hate you?
Well, do you want the serious answer or the not so serious answer? Because it's funny with the Reddit thing is what I hope that they realize that they are playing into it as well, because a hate view counts the same as a love view in my book. I think it all really started with the Daytona Day takedown when NASCAR and Reddit got a hold of that. I don't know. Maybe they are upset that I get recognized a little bit more for their bad opinions or something. I don't know.
So, as for those of you that don't know, David is a YouTuber. You've been on YouTube since what, 2008, I believe?
Yes, I've been on the platform since 2008. I actually started watching YouTube around like 2007. It didn't really become a serious thing for me until around 2014, and it really didn't even start taking off until around 2016, 2017, somewhere around there. And it's just been surreal to see where it's gone. And it's kind of weird as well if you think of the grand scheme of YouTubers. I'm not all that big, but in the motorsports community, it's a little more tight knit, and it's kind of been surprising at times to realize what an impact the channel is beginning to have.
Yeah, definitely, and much respect. I mean, like you said, there's not a lot of motorsport YouTubers that have a whole lot of subscribers. So it is kind of cool to see users on the platform, making a little bit of headway.
Yeah, I mean, it is a niche. That's something that's been discussed quite a bit, just in general about racing, specifically in the last 20 years or so. So, do I wish there were more YouTubers who were like me out there? Absolutely, because not only is that competition, and I'm a very competitive person, I like to be challenged. But having more people talking about it means that it would help the YouTube algorithm to suggest more, IndyCar, sports car, even NASCAR videos. I mean, you've seen I'm sure most of your listeners have seen what NASCAR YouTube has become in the last couple of years
Yes.
with 3 or 4 or 5 different major voices, and I'm one of them. Despite the fact that I'm not by any stretch of the imagination, a straight up NASCAR person, but when I talk about it, I get comparable views to the people who do NASCAR full time. So um, you see the effect of what happens when you have a bunch of different voices willing to voice their opinion. And I would love to see stuff like that happen for IndyCar or IMSA or whatever going forward. And I hope it happens. I don't want to always have a monopoly on it because things can become an echo chamber. And when it's just my videos, kind of stirring the pot, so to speak, on IndyCar YouTube, that doesn't lead to a very interesting discussion.
Right. If I remember correctly, unless I'm wrong, you're one of, if not the only YouTuber that covers the whole month of May at Indianapolis. Is that right?
Um, well, there are people who are on YouTube, or at least have a YouTube presence, who cover the month of May. Obviously, Marshall Pruitt and Robin Miller
Right,
go out
yeah.
on the Racer Channel quite a bit in the month of May. And I'm sure there are a few other people who have a YouTube presence who talk about it. But in terms of a YouTuber who stops virtually every other thing on his channel and goes straight Indy 500 for a month, I am by far the only person who does that. And in fact, I'm sure it'll come up eventually, but that's something that I actually started doing way back in 2013, 2014, was do Indy 500 month. And it was just something that I thought, back in the day when TV companies really cared about the Indy 500 and cared about that style of racing, they would cover the entire month of May in depth, in detail. And for a very long time, that style of content was missing. And my idea was always to kind of bring back that style of just really getting into and analyzing and telling the story of the month of May as a whole.
Well, and it's really crazy that there was that much coverage back then because, like, now there's not nearly as much on track action as there was back then. I mean, at one point there were 4 days of qualifying. Now we've only got two. There's a lot more time spent on track for practice than what there is now. So I mean, yeah, that's crazy to think that there was that much coverage back then compared to what it is now.
True, but you do have now the Grand Prix, and while we could get into that debate, and I don't really want to, the Grand Prix is something that helps extend the month of May. It gives a big event for that first weekend that maybe just opening up the track for practice wouldn't. So there are still things to talk about and cover, and now we've started to have a tire test right at the end of April, at the beginning of May. You might as well can figure that is 3 or 4 extra days of practice just at the beginning of the month, like it kind of used to be. So
Right.
there's plenty of stuff to talk about, and especially because we're getting into the point where IndyCar, or at least the Indy 500 as an event itself, has grown to where you've got 38, 39 cars now, and each of those entries has something to talk about. And certainly IndyCar always ramps up their marketing and promotion. I'm sure we'll have announcements for the future of the sport in the month of May. There's going to be plenty of stuff to talk about. And I'll call out the media just a little bit. Quite frankly, there's still just as much stuff to talk about as there was in the 90s. They're just a little bit lazy about it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean it's good that you point out the whole lazy part in terms of the media because we had to deal with uh, nearly 15 years of ABC/ESPN's coverage of IndyCar racing, which I mean the Indy 500 was always done up, I would say, fairly well every year by ABC. But I would say the rest of the races that they had, I mean, especially the last couple years that they had with IndyCar. Definitely subpar.
IndyCar had some leverage over ABC because ABC wanted the Indy 500 so badly. So the reason we had any network coverage at all for IndyCar outside of the 500 was simply because IndyCar could kind of hold the Indy 500 hostage if they wanted to over ABC. And so IndyCar was able to negotiate places like Belle Isle and St. Petersburg and whatnot getting on the ABC network. But they didn't negotiate any kind of stipulations about investment or on-air talent or any
Right.
of that. It was and ABC made about as bare bones as they could for those other events outside of the Indy 500, and we saw the end result of it.
Right. Yeah, and it's sad because I mean, how long was it? Was it 59 years that ABC had the Indy 500? I believe.
Yes, it was 1965 was the first ABC broadcasted
Gosh.
Indy 500. So I don't know the exact math. I'm sure somebody could do it in their head, but yeah, it was there were still front engine cars and Offenhausers in the field when ABC started, and it was a very long partnership. But quite frankly, it was one that I think was at least beneficial for the Indy 500 to end.
Yeah, it was 54 years. I did the quick math. Yeah, and I would definitely say the deal with NBC now is, I think it's fair to say that it's definitely a better deal because NBC definitely cares more about IndyCar, like the series as a whole, not just the Indy 500. I mean, obviously they've already started promoting the 500 because that's going to be their biggest race, but it seems like they care. But the NBC Gold feature and not streaming the Road to Indy internationally, that's gotten a lot of people upset. To now, there are some people that are actually saying, "Wow, maybe we would have been better off if we would have kept ABC and ESPN," which is crazy to think, honestly.
Yeah, I think it's crazy as well, and I don't want to be misunderstood because I have been very vocal in my criticism of NBC early on in this process. I would not want ABC to have the broadcasting rights. It would have been much worse. But at the same time, personally, I want to hold NBC accountable and not let them repeat a lot of the mistakes that ABC made. I think the people who are coming from it from the perspective of NBC is worse than ABC, or ABC should have gotten the contract, I think are a little bit misguided because sure, NBC screwed up big time at Sonoma. They unfortunately had another issue at St. Pete with the blackout, and in addition to the fact that they probably should have put the race on network NBC like ABC was willing to do with St. Petersburg in the past. They have made mistakes, but in the end of the day, there's clear effort there. There's clear passion there, and particularly again for the Indy 500, NBC clearly wants to show that they are fully capable of making and producing that event as well, if not better than ABC did, maybe even at their heyday.
Now, I do agree with you on that the race definitely should have been on network television, especially being the first race. The first race of that new contract, the first race of the season. It'd be a lot easier to promote the Indianapolis 500 and the rest of the season. I believe there was a soccer game, a major, and I don't follow soccer, so obviously I wouldn't know what was on NBC at the time, but I believe there was a major soccer game going on the main network, NBC, at the time. So I believe there's a scheduling conflict
Everybody
there.
was telling me it was golf.
Really?
That's what I kept hearing was golf, and NBC has a golf channel which they own. So if that was the case, I didn't know there was a major soccer game on. That, but I mean, does soccer do much better ratings than IndyCar racing?
I That's beyond me. I'm not, like I said, I'm not a soccer fan. I mean,
Okay, well,
yeah, that's one of those things where I mean, I I'd obviously say IndyCar over soccer, but you know, I don't make those decisions. So at the end of the day, that's their choice, I guess. Now, I know we're kind of jumping around a little bit, but in the beginning with your channel, David, you were doing, diecast reviews, you were doing uh, gaming videos, and recently, and right around the beginning of your boom, or where your channel began to blossom, there was, your bandwagoners guy. I remember, I think the first bandwagoners guide that I saw was, I believe, 2017. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if you did one for 2017. 2017 Rolex 24 at Daytona.
yep, yep.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I remember that.
That was the first. No, it wasn't the first one, but it was the first one I named a bandwagoner's guide. That makes sense.
Yeah. So what was the first one then?
Oh God, I had been doing guides like that for the Indy 500 for years at that point.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, and I see. I mean, you did one this year, I think, for the Rolex 24. You did
I
one.
actually didn't. It was
You were
unfortunate.
sick.
I got terribly ill. I don't know what
Yes.
it was, but it knocked me on my butt for probably a week and a half, 2 weeks. And if I had known that I was going to get that sick, I would have pre-made a lot of the stuff that you have to make for those. I mean, I'm telling you, those videos require a lot of work, and if you're not 100% and can't put 100% into them, it's very difficult to get them out. So I apologize. The production has been down a little bit in terms of those types of videos this year, and it's just been because I just haven't. At the times that they've come up, I just haven't had 100% to throw at it. To get them up to the quality level that I want them to be. Thankfully, I got the IndyCar one out, so there has been one this year. But I mean, it is an insane amount of work, and I am a one-man band. I don't have a team, so to speak. I'm not that big. Some YouTubers have a lot of people who work for them. I'm I am the one employee of the channel.
So you also do some karting. You recently did that. Actually, I had the privilege of meeting you last year at Indianapolis, which was the second annual USAC karting battle at the Brickyard. That was your first start in a kart. Now, tell me a little bit about that. How you got the opportunity, how that was presented for you to go race there, and just your overall experience there. Because I know you vlogged it. I mean, what did you
Yes.
think about being able to race there?
Uh, well, I guess we have to back up all the way to my childhood. It was always something I wanted to do. I'll be honest with you. I wanted to be a driver growing up. My family never really got behind that idea. At least in terms of my childhood. Now that I've gone and kind of figured out how to do it myself, um, they've been a little bit more. I don't want to say supportive because that sounds disingenuous towards them, but but you know, I wasn't one of these guys who was in a go kart at 8 years old. I wish if it had been my choice, I would have been. Um, and as I've gotten older, um, I've looked for opportunities to get into racing on the driving side of things. I've always wanted to do it. I've always wanted to pursue it. I've always felt that I have some talent, and I've always felt that I've wanted to develop that talent and compete because, like I said, I'm a competitive person. Um, there haven't been a whole lot of opportunities, as I'm sure you're well aware, racing as well. It's expensive, and there's not a lot of people out there who are willing to take a chance on somebody who's never driven before. So you have to be able to find either your own money or get insanely lucky. And I just happened to get insanely lucky. I have I made friends with just happened to make friends with this person named Kyle Cuthbertson, who races. But I'd known him for years before this ever came up. I knew that he raced. His family raced. They're lifelong racers. I think his grandma helped form or at least helped out in the formation of Mid Ohio or something like that. So
Wow.
they're fairly well connected in that scene, and just it came up at one point after they ran Indy last year that they kind of floated the idea to a few of us in my friend group to say, hey, we've got an extra cart chassis just kind of sitting on the shelf, you know, and what we could prepare it if we got an engine for it. So I wasn't even the first choice. They actually approached a couple of other of my friends first, who are local to the Indianapolis area. Currently, I don't live in Indianapolis. I live in New Jersey, but they approached some of the guys who live around there, and it didn't work out for them. So around the month of May last year, they came to me and they said, "Hey, would you like to run Indianapolis with us?" And I said, "I would be honored, but what would it take?" And we figured out what it would take. I actually, with the help of one of my friends, Umer, set up a GoFundMe to allow some of the folks from my channel to help sponsor the effort to get me off the ground, to get a Briggs 206 engine, and go racing there. And once I got there, I mean, the first time I sat in the cart was to go out for the second practice session because we missed the first practice session. That became a common theme, but it was a great experience. Obviously, you can go check out the vlog for all the details, but it was a great experience. I was really happy that I wasn't completely garbage. I was able to race and compete, and I made a couple of mistakes, but considering it was my first race, and folks who've been racing a lot longer than I have told me that I did just fine considering the circumstances. So yeah, it's going to continue this year. I've made some investments to my equipment and plan to be making a few more. And hopefully, I still got a vlog from last year that I need to put up on the channel. I just haven't gotten around to editing it. Hopefully, I'll be able to do that before the first race of this season. But yeah, we're
Newcastle,
just going
right?
to continue with the content, with the racing, and hopefully that'll be a whole new avenue of YouTube content that really hasn't been. I mean, there are lots of there's lots of go-karting content out there, but there's not a lot of the style of stuff like I did at the Battle of the Brickyard. So I'm hoping that to kind of create a new subgenre and whatnot.
Yeah, almost like a documentary almost. I remember that. It was like a voiceover as well as, you doing part of the vlogging, and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
thought that was pretty neat.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I'm hoping, and this is hoping at this point, but and I can I don't I will just say that there has been some interest from some folks who are connected within the industry in working with me in the future because of that content. So that's another thing that I've looked at and thought about when producing that content was, this is an opportunity and a platform. I may not have a billionaire dad to fund my racing career, but if I can create a platform which is unique in racing, or at least a platform that is attractive to people who want to get their message out through racing, it's a unique and different avenue, and that's kind of another part of why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it, is to just differentiate myself from everybody else who's out there, because most of those races I'm in have 50 carts.
Right,
It's
yeah.
tough to become unique in that avenue.
In kart racing, I mean, it's so competitive. I mean, it's the bare bottom, low end of the totem pole form of racing. It's the lowest form of racing out there, and yet just to get into it, you're dropping $5,000, $10,000. Let alone, you got to be competitive, so you're spending even more money in it. And from the driver's aspect, it's also mentally and physically grueling. So it's, yeah, I mean, it takes a lot to be on top. So having that
Well,
help would
consider
definitely.
this too. I mean, I've spoken to IndyCar engineers who say they'd rather wrench on their Indy car than wrench on a go kart to try to get it fast. So while it is the bottom rung of the road to Indy, the proverbial road to Indy, so to speak. Uh, it's not going to your local Rascals Fun Zone or whatever. I mean, it is true racing. It is difficult. It requires investment. It requires commitment. It requires you can't go in it half-hearted and expect to uh, even be remotely competitive. So, and that's I thrive in that kind of an environment. I personally love it, and and it's awesome. And that's kind of what if you've ever heard Ayrton Senna's quote, that's like karting is the purest form of motorsport. So I don't know if people have ever heard of that guy, but he might have known what he was talking about.
Yeah, definitely. So let's jump into the discussion here. So IndyCar at St. Petersburg. It wasn't controversial like last year, but it was. I think it was pretty entertaining, honestly. Street racing is usually pretty entertaining. End of the race, Joseph Newgarden, they worked out that strategy for him to get out front, and obviously was able to maintain that gap at the end. And the rookies, I think, was the most notable part of the race. You had Felix Rosenqvist, you had Colton Herta, and you had Santino Ferrucci all in the top 10. Marcus Ericsson had a mechanical problem, I believe, which put him out. And then Ben Hanley, I mean, he ended up going, I believe, a lap down or two. Dragon Speed's first race in the series, they were 2 seconds off in qualifying at one point, or was it? It was. I think it was practice. First practice, they were 2 seconds off. The next person in
It was
front of
more
them.
than that. It was
Really?
about 4 seconds in the first practice.
Oh, geez. Maybe I was looking at FP3 then.
Yeah, I do want to give an asterisk next to the Dragon Speed. I think their performance was very impressive considering the circumstances. They just received
Definitely.
that cart about probably a month ago. They built it up. They did about 200 miles of testing and shipped it to St. Pete. They got lucky in qualifying. They qualified 12th. They stayed out there all day. They got logged miles. They brought the car home in one piece. I I think it was an underrated performance, and considering how competitive IndyCar is, I thought they did great.
And Ben Hanley being a sports car guy, being out there and he kept it off the wall. Didn't run into anybody. No spins, no nothing. I mean, they were laps down, but
Well, that's the
first
thing about
race,
that team, though. They've competed at a high level. I mean, they compete in the World Endurance Championship. We're going to
right,
go see
yeah.
them at Sebring here in a couple days. They race against Toyota. They're in Toyota's class, so they know how to race with the big dogs. I wasn't that concerned about it, but again, they're a team that's virtually unknown. A lot of people don't even know who they are or what they do. So um, they definitely had a good showing. First off.
I think the one thing I was concerned about with them coming into it was, these newer teams that we've had in the last couple years enter IndyCar, like Carlin, Juncos, Meyer Shank Racing. These teams had other open wheel teams prior to, whether it would be Indy Lights. I mean, Carlin, they had their team in Europe. These teams had been in open wheel racing before making the jump to IndyCar. That's, I guess, and I mean, World Endurance Championship, that's one of the highest forms of racing, albeit sports cars. So yeah, I was a little skeptical coming into it about Dragon Speed, but I mean, they definitely proved everybody wrong.
Well, Hanley was actually in the Renault Young Drivers program around 2008, 2009. Unfortunately, the Renault Formula One team fell apart after the spin gate with Nelson Piquet at the Singapore Grand Prix. It became Lotus, and the Renault money went away. And Ben Hanley kind of got caught out. He actually went back to karting, of all things,
Gosh,
and became a professional there for years before he got this opportunity with Dragon Speed to race with them in the sports cars. So he has open wheel experience. It's well back in the day, but he's no slouch.
Yep, that's for sure. He's proven it. That's good to see for those guys. Felix Rosenqvist, who is a guy that's been talked about around the IndyCar scene for years, finally has had his opportunity to show what he can do in an IndyCar, and I think he is every bit of the hype.
That was a very impressive performance in
Very,
St. Petersburg.
definitely.
I mean, it felt like I think I said in my video. I mean, it felt Wickens like. It felt very similar to what happened last year with Robert Wickens, just a guy coming out of not necessarily out of left field, but just coming out of the box, swinging and proving that immediately, hey, I belong, and I'm going to race at the front, and we're going to go for wins immediately. And seeing as the 10 car at Ganassi really hasn't been that
No,
since Franchitti was in it, and even Franchitti started to struggle towards the end of his career. Um, yeah, I mean that's the first time we've seen that car that competitive in a very long time.
you know how many wins the 10 car has in the DW12 era, the chassis as is. So basically, since 2012, you know how many wins that team has?
Oh God, it's probably I think it's two. I think it's the Indy
Two.
500 and the Fontana 500.
Right. Yep. 2012 Indy. That was Franchitti's last win, so he basically went a season and a half without winning before his career-ending crash. And then Kanaan, yeah, you're right, won Auto Club in 2014. So that 10 car, they've been waiting on an arrival of somebody like Felix Rosenqvist for a while now.
A lot of people thought it would be Ed Jones.
Yeah,
Wasn't.
and to me that I kind of wondered if it was maybe the pressure of racing for Ganassi. You know, first season there, you know, trying to get acclimated. But then there's parts of last year I was like, man, is this like Nicholas Manassian again? You know, I was a little worried, but you know,
He
obviously,
had a sophomore slump, no doubt about it. But you know, Ed's a fast driver, and you know, him being in an Ed Carpenter car at the 500, look out,
yeah,
because that's a dark horse right there. Considering how fast those cars were last year, and considering how fast Ed Jones was in his rookie year in 2017, I think that could be a car to look for.
right. And nobody really expected the Dale Coyne cars to be fast on the speedways in 2017, and Ed Jones got them a podium, and James Davison of all people ran up at the front before crashing out in that race. So
And
yeah,
speaking of Davison, he is back with that team in this. Well, not the same car, but he's with that team with that engineering staff again. There's another guy who may surprise when we get to the month of May.
gosh, there's a lot to be excited about come May time. So let's jump into a little bit of NASCAR discussion. I know, admittedly, David, you said you're not 100% a NASCAR guy, but it's still interesting to talk about and be a part of. Kyle Busch versus Richard Petty. Everybody's been talking about it. Love it or hate it. Feels like we're beating a dead horse. Richard Petty with 200 Cup Series victories versus Kyle's 199 top three NASCAR division wins. Where do you stand on the whole thing? Because there's people that say, you know, Kyle is better because he's in a more competitive era. There's people that say Petty's got the upper hand because he did it all at the top level in NASCAR.
I think it's a great meme. It's very funny. I don't take it that seriously, to be honest with you. Uh, I think there's merit. I think there's merit on both sides, to be honest with you. I think that yes, Kyle has 53, I think it is, Cup Series wins, and at this point in his career, be I would not feel comfortable comparing him to a Jeff Gordon or a David Pearson. But on the other hand, Petty's wins, people point this out and they get backlash, but they're legitimate when they point this out. Is that, you know, Richard Petty for the longest time, a lot of the NASCAR wins, the Cup Series quote unquote wins that he had, would have been the modern equivalent of bushwhacking. He would
Yeah,
go to these small tracks where, you know, you wouldn't have the David Pearson show up every week. Petty ran almost every week, and because he had the budget from Plymouth, to do that in STP.
STP, yeah.
But he would be able to go in there with the best, most reliable equipment and win a lot of races and clean up. Very similar, in fact, to what Kyle Busch does
Right.
these days in the Cup and in the Xfinity and Truck Series. Now that being said, NASCAR has at least marketed those other two series as developmental series. Now, whether they are or aren't actually is another whole debate in and of itself. But I don't know. I don't feel like, I don't feel like Kyle Busch's 200 wins are in some way less impressive than not Kyle Petty's, Richard Petty's wins, 200 wins. But by the same token, I don't think that's the problem. I guess I get to is that I don't think Richard Petty is as good. I got to say this very carefully.
Yeah.
I don't think he's as good as a David Pearson or as a Dale Earnhardt or as a Jeff Gordon.
Right.
I think I would rank him lower than those drivers. So when you say Kyle Busch may be better than Richard Petty, I would be maybe able to accept that. Is he the best driver NASCAR's ever seen? Not yet.
No. Nope.
That's kind of my assessment of it.
Right. And I look at it from both sides too, and I think it's definitely fair to say I guess you got to ask these two different questions because they're very different. Was Richard Petty the best talent that NASCAR ever saw, or was Richard Petty the most accomplished driver that NASCAR ever saw? And I think you'll get two different answers for that. Obviously, definitely the most accomplished. 7 Daytona 500s, 7 Cup Championships, 200 wins, albeit running, 60-plus races a season, I think NASCAR did back in the day, running on dirt tracks, and some races they'd have 14, 15, less than 20 cars. But then there was also races, I saw one stat, there was a Southern 500 that he raced in that he won. There were 80 entrants. So that's one thing I guess you have to kind of look at lightly or more perspective when you think of it like that. And you're right, when you compare those, Kyle Busch is winning a lot of these races and what's supposed to be a developmental series. Now, like you said, whether it is or not, that's for everybody to determine on their own opinion. I would say, though, and I think it's funny that this isn't even a part of the discussion. I can't believe that we've completely dropped the ball on this, but nobody has talked about how, except maybe DW on Sunday during the broadcast, that Jeff Gordon, with 93 wins, has the most in the modern era of any Cup driver. And I think that's how are people not talking about that? I think, to me, I just think it's a marketing ploy. I think that's more than anything what it is, because Kyle himself doesn't care. I mean, he even said himself, we're different. You can't compare them. They're different. They're two different people, two different eras, two different stat lines.
You're absolutely right in that assessment with the marketing ploy. There is something to be said about NASCAR rage, NASCAR fans' rage, and it is something that's real. I mean, if you can get NASCAR fans mad, they're more likely to tune in. That's just the way it is. So, if you say, if you even suggest that Kyle Busch may be better than Richard Petty, that'll get people mad. And guess what? They're gonna tune in to the bad Xfinity race where Kyle Busch wins by 10 seconds, just because they're gonna get mad at Kyle Busch. They want to be there so that they can rage on Twitter when he wins the 200th NASCAR race.
See, I think it's worth pointing out, and it's one thing that's often forgotten about Richard Petty's era of NASCAR. That was an era where reliability was a huge thing, which, like you said, he had the support of Plymouth as well as STP, so he's running the best stuff. NASCAR now, reliability is not even really talked about or thought of. You don't see many engine failures anymore. You don't see many mechanical failures anymore. It's not something that you see. And another thing to think about is, I believe Richard Petty's career spanned over the course of 35 years that he accumulated those 200 wins. Now, I know those last 8 or so years weren't very successful, but when you think about this in retrospect, for a driver to come in and be as successful as Richard Petty would have to win, on average, 10 races a season over the course of 20 years. Which we're now getting to the point with professional motorsports where drivers aren't even seeing 20-year careers in that specific series. Like any given series, there's not many drivers that are seeing 20-plus year careers anymore. So I think that it's worth looking at it from that. Definitely not going to see 200 in terms of the Cup Series. But seeing somebody even be remotely close, even if you look at somebody like David Pearson being as successful as him, I don't think that's something you're ever going to see.
You brought up a great point about reliability. With as choked down as the Cup Series motors are, with the tapered spacers, it's almost as if reliability is more of a concern in Xfinity than it is in the Cup Series now. We saw engines blowing up in the Xfinity race, nothing in the Cup race. So, you bring that up, and if you want to make a difficulty comparison, Kyle Busch at least has to worry about his Xfinity motor blowing up. I don't really know if he really has to worry about it in the Cup Series when he wins.
Right. And that was one thing, and I know since the Cup Series package has been released, I think people have lightened up about it a little bit in terms of the on-track action. But I remember at the beginning of this season when we first started doing this podcast, one thing that I talked about was, are these Cup drivers going to get to the point where they don't like this package to the point where they think they're not challenged enough to where they start running the Xfinity Series full-time versus the Cup Series, which would be huge for NASCAR. I know that would be a big eye-opener for a lot of people if that happened. I don't know if that's something that would ever happen, but I think the world would almost come unhinged if you saw somebody like Kevin Harvick or Brad Keselowski or Joey Logano leave the Cup Series to go race potentially a more challenging car in the Xfinity Series full-time.
We still haven't seen the dominoes fall on the new package yet. So new now that a lot of people are either curious or they're convinced that it's totally different than it used to be. And my assessment of it has been, and always, or at least not has been, but since I've been watching it, my assessment is it's virtually the same NASCAR, but slower. I think people will start realizing that. I think the drivers have been hesitant to talk about it, especially after the Kyle Busch quote, where he said it would require no more skill because you're opened up to a lot of criticism. You're opened up to that whole NASCAR Twitter coming after you if you scout like Kyle Busch did. I think that drivers might end up in Xfinity? Probably not. I feel like there's still enough cash in NASCAR where drivers are willing to put up with driving something that they don't like to make money. That being said, there's going to come a point where drivers like Kyle Larson or Kyle Busch or maybe some of these other guys end up saying, you know what, I'm done with the Cup Series, and they might move on to dirt or even possibly, Indy cars. You never know. We know that Kyle Busch is almost a lock for the 2020 Indy 500.
Yes.
Maybe if he gets a taste of it, he'll want to come and play a little bit more. You never know. Stranger things have happened.
Right, and everybody thought the world was going to end when Kurt announced that he was going to run. I mean, when he first tested an IndyCar and the initial thought that he could possibly run this race, everybody's like, "Whoa, Kurt Busch in an IndyCar? Well, that's not going to work." And then he ended up finishing sixth in his only Indy 500 start. I mean, it was in an Andretti car, but I mean, your first IndyCar race with no prior open wheel experience, and you finish sixth. It just kind of proves that you're a professional racing driver.
When Kurt Busch did that, there had been no double attempts at all since 2004, and no drivers were really crossing over at that point. At least between the major series, there was no NASCAR to IndyCar, IndyCar to NASCAR. Specials. There was certainly no Formula One to IndyCar crossovers like we ended up getting in 17. But it was that was definitely a moment that really shifted a lot of perceptions. Sure.
Well, I saw an interesting thing. I believe it was on Twitter that Eric Almirola was asked about running the Indy 500.
You're gonna get me mad.
I was mad by it too, so it's not like it'd be much of an argument. But Eric Almirola essentially said that to run the Indy 500 or to run an IndyCar, it's mostly car and somewhat driver. And to that point, I think he could not be more wrong.
But clearly didn't watch St. Pete.
No.
Because there's guys crawling out of the cars that look like they've been in a 12-round fight. They're drenched in sweat.
Yeah.
They're clearly sore.
And those races aren't even as long as NASCAR races.
Yeah.
In terms of mileage and time.
Somebody needs to put Almirola in the damn two-seater with Mario. Get him an education.
And that's not even an aggressive open-wheel car. Imagine him in a real thing, yeah. So, yeah, IndyCar racing is blossoming, whether people choose to believe that or not. Only time will tell, obviously. But to make the comparison that it's all car and no driver, I think you could make more of a comparison to F1 with Mercedes the last couple years than what you could to any IndyCar team.
Sure, but you do see a difference, even between the two drivers at Mercedes. I'm not sure that a Valtteri Bottas could beat Hamilton straight up.
No.
That's
definitely not.
So driver still makes a difference.
Definitely.
Even at F1.
Well, and it's not like you could throw any Joe Schmo in an F1 car and they'd go out there and run fast. It's a craft. That's what it is. They get paid good money to do what they do. It's because they know what they're doing. They get paid to drive a race car at 200, sometimes 200 plus miles an hour on straightaways, and they definitely earn their keep doing it.
F1 gets a bad rap because some of the backmarking teams have to hire, or rather bring in, drivers that are significantly less talented than some of their competitors because they bring such the cash flow needed to compete in Formula One, and that's the great problem. Not a problem, but that's the great trade-off with F1 is that you get the incredible technological advancement, but you also only have the best drivers in the top 10 cars, and then maybe the other 10 cars are not so talented.
Well, you're right, and it takes an incredible amount of money to put together a full season program for F1. I don't even know a finite number, but
hundreds of millions of dollars.
Hundreds of millions, yeah. So that's not pocket change by any means. I don't think any of us could be seen in the F1 car anytime soon. So yeah, that wraps it up on this week's episode of the Pit Limiter podcast. David, tell our listeners where they can find you on social media if they already haven't found you.
Check me out on YouTube. You could search my name, David Land, DAVIDLAND. It's 9 letters, pretty easy. A nice big purple logo. Get get all your motorsports content needs there. I try to provide the best content possible, and I also try to give you a perspective that maybe you don't hear in the mainstream racing press.
It's awesome. Go check them out. David, I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on and talking with us.
No problem. My pleasure. I always try to, as I told you off the air, I try to pay it forward a little bit and come on these shows when people ask me to do it, and it was a pleasure.
Awesome. Make sure you guys follow the Pit Limiter podcast on Twitter at the Pit Limiter. We recently had the episodes put on Apple Podcasts. You can check us out on any podcast platform, usually on Tuesday nights. Make sure you guys like us on Facebook at the Pit Limiter podcast, and make sure you check out our YouTube channel as well. We upload episodes to there as well. Make sure you follow me on Twitter and Instagram at ZBuchanan4. Check out my karting channel, Zach Buchanan, and check out my karting page on Facebook as well. That's going to do it. Thanks, guys, for watching, and we'll see you next week on the Pit Limiter podcast.